He went on a regular hunt into a remote forest where almost no one goes, but strange signs led him to something that should not have been there. From that moment on, the hunt was over. The more he realized what he had found, the stronger the shock became, and the more dangerous it felt to simply know about it. The forest had always been a place where time loosened its grip. For the man, it was not merely a hunting ground or a stretch of land marked on a map, but a familiar refuge where the world simplified itself into sounds, distances, and signs that could be read if one paid enough attention. He had come here many times before, always alone except for the dog, and always with the same intention: to move slowly, to think clearly, and to let the noise of ordinary life fade until it no longer followed him between the trees. He was in his mid-40s, old enough to know his limits and experienced enough to respect them. Hunting was not a sport for him, nor a test of bravado. It was a discipline shaped by years of routine, patience, and restraint. He had learned long ago that the forest punished carelessness and rewarded those who observed before acting. Every movement, every decision had to be measured. That approach extended beyond hunting itself and into the way he lived. He trusted patterns, he trusted preparation, he trusted silence. The dog moved a few paces ahead, alert but calm, its body language controlled and efficient. It was not a pet in the sentimental sense, but a trained companion whose instincts complemented the man's own experience. The animal rarely acted without reason, and when it did, the man noticed. Over years together, they had developed a shared rhythm that required no commands, only attention. The area he had chosen lay far from maintained paths and seasonal visitors. There were no marked trails here, no clearings shaped by frequent footsteps. Reaching it required navigating old forestry roads that had long since begun to disappear beneath new growth, and then continuing on foot through terrain that discouraged casual exploration. That isolation was deliberate. He had no interest in competing with others for space or game. More importantly, he valued the certainty that whatever happened out here would remain unseen unless he chose otherwise. The forest itself reflected that isolation. The trees stood tall and densely packed, their trunks rising straight before vanishing into a canopy that filtered the sunlight into uneven patches. The ground beneath was layered with dry leaves, broken twigs, and exposed roots, with only sparse grass managing to grow where the light reached long enough. The air carried the scent of soil and wood, dry but not lifeless, and each step produced a muted sound that blended into the larger stillness. As he moved deeper, the familiar sense of control settled over him. His thoughts slowed. His awareness sharpened. He took note of wind direction, of distant bird movement, of the subtle changes in terrain that suggested the presence or absence of animals. Everything followed the patterns he expected, and for a while the forest offered nothing unusual in return. It was the dog that first disrupted that balance. At first the change was subtle. The animal paused more often, lowering its head to the ground, inhaling deeply before lifting its gaze and scanning the surrounding trees. The man noticed but did not immediately react. Such behavior could mean many things, and none of them demanded urgency. He adjusted his pace, allowing the dog more freedom to investigate while keeping his own movements quiet and deliberate. As they continued, the pauses grew longer. The dog began to circle certain areas, not tracking a moving scent, but lingering as if something static held its attention. Its tail stiffened slightly, and its ears angled forward in a way that suggested concentration rather than excitement. There was no barking, no sudden bursts of energy, only a focused tension that the man recognized as out of place. He stopped and surveyed the area more carefully. The forest around them appeared unchanged at first glance, but experience had taught him that first impressions were often misleading. He examined the ground, the spacing between trees, the way fallen branches lay. It was then that he noticed the irregularities. The soil in one small section was compressed in a manner inconsistent with animal movement. Leaves lay arranged too evenly, as if they had been placed rather than dropped. The signs were faint, but together they formed a pattern that did not belong. The dog returned to that same spot repeatedly, nose close to the ground, inhaling with deliberate care. It did not behave as it would when following prey. Instead, its attention seemed anchored to the earth itself. The man felt a mild tightening in his chest, Not fear, but recognition. Whatever was here had been left behind by human hands. He knelt and brushed aside the top layer of leaves. Beneath them, the soil appeared disturbed, packed down more firmly than the surrounding forest floor. A careful sweep revealed the edge of something solid. Wood, old, weathered, but unmistakably shaped. He cleared more debris, working slowly, mindful of leaving as little trace as possible. Soon the outline of several planks emerged, arranged in a way that suggested purpose rather than collapse. They were positioned to cover something, not randomly scattered. The man paused, listening, allowing the forest to reassert itself around him. Nothing moved. No distant footsteps, no unfamiliar sounds. Only then did he continue. As the covering was removed, the shape beneath became clear. A square wooden surface lay embedded in the ground, its edges fitted closely to the surrounding soil. There were signs of age, but also signs of maintenance. This was not a relic abandoned and forgotten. It had been concealed carefully, deliberately, and not so long ago that nature had fully reclaimed it. The dog stood close now, head lowered, breathing in the air that seeped through narrow gaps along the edges. Its posture was tense but controlled, as if it sensed something unfamiliar below, but could not determine its source. The man reached out and tested the surface, applying gentle pressure. It held firm. He searched for a point of access and found it near one corner, a subtle indentation, worn smooth by repeated use. He hesitated not from uncertainty, but from instinct. Opening this would cross an invisible line. Whatever lay beneath had been meant to stay hidden, and uncovering it would inevitably lead somewhere he had not planned to go. He straightened and scanned the forest once more. The trees stood silent and indifferent, their height swallowing any sense of direction beyond the immediate area. This was a place where things could remain unseen for years, perhaps decades. The thought lingered longer than it should have. At last, he returned his attention to the wooden surface and applied steady force. It shifted with a muted creak, releasing a breath of cold air from below. The opening revealed darkness beneath, dense and absolute, accompanied by the faint smell of damp wood and earth. The man did not descend yet. He remained still, one hand resting on the edge of the opening, the other instinctively aware of the dog at his side. The forest behind him remained unchanged, but the ground at his feet had transformed into something else entirely. Whatever lay below belonged to a different layer of the world, one that had been deliberately buried and carefully preserved. He understood then that his hunt had already ended, replaced by something he could not yet define. The silence around him no longer felt neutral. It felt expectant. And somewhere beneath the forest floor, something waited. The forest did not react to the opening of the hatch. No birds scattered from the trees, no sudden wind stirred the canopy, and no distant sounds hinted at human presence. That, more than anything else, unsettled the man. He had learned to trust the forest's responses over the years. When something disrupted its balance, there were usually signs. Now there were none. He remained still for several moments, listening. The cold air rising from the opening brushed against his face, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp wood, compacted soil, and something older, something sealed away from sunlight for a long time. It was not the smell of rot, but of preservation, the kind that came from places not meant to be disturbed. The dog stood close, its body angled slightly toward the opening. It did not attempt to peer inside, but it lowered its head and inhaled deeply, then pulled back as if uncertain how to interpret what it sensed. Its ears twitched at sounds only it could hear, yet it did not retreat. That told the man enough. Whatever was below did not feel immediately threatening, but it was wrong. He shifted his weight and examined the edges of the opening more carefully. The wooden frame was fitted flush with the ground, its corners squared and reinforced. Moss had begun to grow along the seams, and a thin layer of soil had collected in places, but the structure beneath remained intact. This was not a hastily dug pit or a collapsed cellar. It was something deliberately constructed, with time and care invested in keeping it hidden. He scanned the surrounding area again, this time with greater focus. The trees closest to the hatch were older, their roots thick and exposed in places, weaving through the forest floor like veins. No recent tracks were visible beyond the immediate disturbed area, but that meant little. A person who knew how to move through the forest could leave almost nothing behind. The man knew this because he had done it himself. Carefully, he cleared more debris from the edges of the hatch, ensuring it would not snap shut unexpectedly. He tested the hinges, noting the resistance. They were stiff but functional, maintained. That detail lodged itself in his mind and refused to leave. He did not rush to descend. Instead, he forced himself to think through the situation with the same methodical approach he used when tracking game. He considered the possibilities. This could be an old storage cellar, forgotten and sealed long ago. It could be an abandoned shelter, left behind by someone who no longer needed it. Or it could be something far less benign. The problem was not the structure itself, but the care with which it had been hidden. The leaves had been arranged deliberately, not simply scattered. The boards above had been placed in a way that allowed them to be removed and replaced without leaving obvious signs. Someone had wanted this place to disappear into the forest, but not permanently. He made a decision. Before going any further, he secured the dog a short distance away, positioning it where it could still see him but would not interfere. The animal resisted slightly, its attention still fixed on the opening, but it obeyed. He took out his flashlight, tested it, and adjusted the strap on his pack. Every movement was precise, unhurried. He lowered himself slowly, gripping the edge of the hatch as he eased 1 foot down into the darkness. The air grew cooler immediately. The walls pressed in close at first, forcing him to angle his shoulders as he descended. After a few careful steps, the space widened and his boots touched solid ground. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a small chamber reinforced with wood and concrete. The ceiling was low but stable, supported by beams that showed signs of age but no immediate decay. Moisture clung to the lower sections of the walls, yet the structure held firm, resisting the slow collapse that claimed most abandoned spaces. He took a step forward and paused. The room was not empty. A narrow bed frame stood against one wall, covered with a thin mattress and a folded blanket. Nearby, a small table held several empty cans and a lantern. Along the far side of the chamber, shelves had been built into the wall, stocked with supplies arranged in a careful, almost obsessive order. Canned food, bottled water, medical supplies, everything placed with intention. This was not a relic. The man moved deeper into the space, his flashlight tracing the outlines of objects that told a story far more unsettling than the structure itself. A portable generator sat in one corner, disconnected but clean. Fuel containers were stacked nearby, their caps tightly sealed. A crude ventilation system ran up through the ceiling, its opening concealed somewhere above ground. The engineering was simple but effective. Someone had lived here. The realization carried weight. The bed was not covered in dust. The lantern showed signs of recent use. The floor bore faint scuff marks where boots had moved back and forth repeatedly. Time had passed in this room, measured not in days but in years, possibly decades. He crouched and examined the shelves more closely. Some of the cans were old, their labels faded, but others were clearly newer. Modern packaging, recent expiration dates. Whoever had occupied this place had continued to resupply it well into the present. A chill settled in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He straightened slowly, listening again. The forest above remained silent. No footsteps, no voices, no mechanical sounds. Yet the evidence around him suggested that this space had not been abandoned for long. Perhaps days, perhaps weeks. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He moved cautiously, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. His instincts told him that this was not a place to leave obvious signs of intrusion. If someone returned and noticed changes, the consequences could be unpredictable. Near the back wall, partially concealed behind stacked containers, he found a small storage compartment built into the structure. It was closed, but not locked. He hesitated before opening it, aware that each discovery pushed him further beyond the point of simply turning back. Inside, he found additional supplies, neatly packed, and a bundle wrapped in plastic. He did not open it yet. Instead, he closed the compartment and stepped back, reassessing the room as a whole. This place had been designed for long-term concealment. The person who built it had planned to stay hidden, to exist outside of normal life, sustained by preparation and discipline. The question was not how they survived, but why they felt the need to disappear so completely. The man looked up toward the narrow opening above, where a faint outline of daylight marked the exit. It seemed impossibly far away now, as though the forest he had known moments ago belonged to another world. Above him, the dog let out a low sound, barely audible through the layers of earth and wood. It was not a bark, but a warning. He froze. For a long moment, nothing happened. The sound did not repeat. No footsteps followed. Still, the message was clear. The dog sensed something. Whether it was the lingering scent of the inhabitant or something more immediate, he could not tell. He extinguished the flashlight for a brief second, standing in complete darkness. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and absolute. In that darkness, he understood one undeniable truth. This was not just a shelter. It was a hiding place. And whoever had hidden here had done so for reasons that had not yet lost their power. With controlled movements, he turned the flashlight back on and began a careful retreat toward the ladder, already aware that leaving this place would not mean leaving it behind. The forest above waited for him, unchanged in appearance but altered in meaning. As he climbed back toward the opening, he felt the first real stirrings of unease. Not fear of what lay beneath the ground, but fear of what this discovery might eventually demand of him. The hatch creaked softly as he pushed it open, letting daylight spill into the chamber one last time. He paused, taking a final look at the space below, committing every detail to memory. Then he climbed out, pulling himself back into the forest, knowing that the hunt he had come for was long forgotten. Something else had taken its place, and it was far more dangerous than anything he had expected to find. The forest accepted him back without resistance. Light filtered through the canopy as it had before, and the air felt warmer after the chill below. Yet the sense of familiarity was gone. The man stood still beside the closed hatch, listening to his own breathing and to the faint sounds of the woods, aware that the ground beneath his boots now concealed something that could not be unseen. The dog approached cautiously, nose low, circling the spot where the hatch lay, hidden again, beneath leaves and soil. It sniffed with renewed focus, as if trying to reconcile the sense of earth, wood, and human presence that clung to the place. The man watched the animal closely, reading its posture the way he always did. The dog was not alarmed, but it was unsettled. That alone confirmed the man's growing conviction that whatever lay beneath the forest floor belonged to a world that had intersected with this one far too recently. He did not leave immediately. Instead, he forced himself to slow down and think. Rushing away would satisfy instinct, not judgment. He had spent years training himself to observe first, act second. That discipline had kept him safe more than once. He knelt near the hatch again, careful not to disturb the ground further, and considered what he had already seen. The space below was small but purposeful. Everything about it suggested planning rather than desperation. The supports were solid, the supplies calculated. This was not the work of someone improvising in a moment of panic. It was the work of someone who expected to stay hidden for a long time and intended to survive there comfortably enough to endure it. That realization alone changed the nature of the discovery. This was not an abandoned cellar from a forgotten era, nor a temporary shelter built for a season. It was a residence, albeit one buried beneath the forest. Someone had lived there quietly, deliberately, and with enough resources to remain unseen for years if necessary. The man glanced at the dog again. Its attention had shifted slightly, no longer fixed on the hatch but scanning the surrounding trees. That worried him more than if it had remained focused on the ground. Dogs reacted to the present, not the past. If it sensed something beyond residual scent, it meant the forest around them was no longer entirely empty. He decided then that if he was going to leave, he would do so only after understanding more. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. The difference mattered. If someone had lived beneath this ground recently, there was a chance they might return. And if they did, the man needed to know what he was dealing with. He reopened the hatch more carefully this time, adjusting the leaves and soil in a way that would allow him to restore the concealment later. The cold air rose again, carrying that same preserved stillness. He secured the dog a little farther away than before, positioning it where it could watch both the opening and the surrounding forest. Only when he was satisfied did he descend once more. The space felt smaller the second time. Familiarity stripped away the shock, leaving only the stark reality of the environment. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the walls, lingering on details he had only noted in passing before. The wooden supports bore tool marks that spoke of careful workmanship. The concrete sections were rough but reinforced, poured in the stages rather than all at once. Someone had taken their time here, improving and adapting the space as needs changed. He approached the bed again, this time examining it more closely. The mattress was thin but intact, with no signs of decay. The blanket had been folded deliberately, not tossed aside. He touched the fabric briefly, feeling its dryness. This was not something that had been left untouched for decades. Moisture would have claimed it long ago if that were the case. On the table nearby, he noticed something he had overlooked before. A small stack of papers lay partially tucked beneath the lantern. He picked them up carefully. They were old newspapers, but not ancient. Their dates spanned several years, not consecutive but spaced out, as though someone had brought them down selectively. Headlines spoke of events that stirred faint recognition in his memory. Local incidents, missing persons, court proceedings, stories that had once circulated widely and then faded. He set the papers down slowly, his thoughts beginning to align around a troubling possibility. This place was not merely a refuge from the world. It might have been a vantage point from which someone observed it. Moving along the shelves, he examined the supplies more thoroughly. The organization was meticulous. Food items were grouped by type and expiration date. Medical supplies were sealed and labeled. Tools were cleaned and stored properly after use. This was the environment of a disciplined mind, not someone unraveling under pressure. He crouched near the generator, inspecting it with a practiced eye. It showed wear consistent with use, but had been maintained carefully. The fuel containers were dated with faded markings, some old, some newer. This confirmed what his instincts had already told him. The occupant had not vanished years ago. They had been here recently enough to matter. A faint sound reached his ears then, subtle enough that he almost dismissed it. He froze, holding his breath, listening. It was not a noise from above. It came from within the structure itself, a soft creak as the materials adjusted to shifting temperature. He let out a slow breath, irritated with himself for the momentary tension, but unwilling to ignore it entirely. He turned his attention to the storage compartment he had noticed earlier. This time he opened it. Inside, the compartment contained several sealed containers and a box wrapped tightly in layers of plastic. He removed the box and set it on the floor, hesitating only briefly before unwrapping it. The plastic crinkled softly, the sound echoing more loudly than he expected in the confined space. The contents forced him to sit back on his heels. Inside were personal items, a wallet, a set of keys, a watch with a scratched face and a worn leather band. He picked up the wallet carefully and opened it. The identification inside was old but legible. The photograph showed a man younger than the one who now held the card, but the features were distinct enough to leave no doubt. He recognized the face. The name struck him with quiet force. It belonged to someone who had been declared dead years ago. He closed the wallet slowly, his mind racing as memories surfaced. The case had been widely reported at the time, a disappearance that had drawn attention, speculation, and eventually resignation. The official conclusion had been clear enough. An accident, a body never found, but circumstances deemed sufficient. Life had moved on, except it hadn't. The watch bore signs of recent wear. The keys were modern. None of this fit with the narrative of a man who had died years earlier. The evidence pointed toward a single, unsettling conclusion. Whoever this person was, they had survived, and they had chosen to live beneath the forest rather than return to the world above. The implications were profound. If this man was alive, then everything associated with his disappearance demanded reevaluation. The investigation, the conclusions, the people involved. The man felt the weight of that realization settle heavily on his shoulders. He had not gone looking for this. He had not sought out buried truths or unresolved histories. Yet here he was, standing in a space that contradicted an official record and hinted at something far more complex beneath it. He returned the items to the box, resealing it carefully. He understood now that this place was more than a shelter. It was a repository of identity, preserved and hidden away from a world that believed it no longer existed. A faint noise from above drew his attention again. This time, it was unmistakable. The dog shifted position, claws scraping softly against wood and soil. It did not bark, but its breathing changed, quickening slightly. The man felt his muscles tense. He extinguished the flashlight once more, standing in the darkness, listening. The silence stretched, heavy and absolute, broken only by the slow, steady sound of his own pulse. After several seconds, the noise above subsided. The dog settled, though it did not fully relax. He turned the flashlight back on, his resolve hardening. He had learned enough to know that leaving now, without further understanding, would be dangerous. Ignorance in this case was not safety. He scanned the room again, committing details to memory: the layout, the supplies, the way certain items had been positioned, as though ready for immediate use. This was not a place abandoned in haste. If the occupant had left, it had been intentional. The man made his way back toward the ladder, moving slowly, minimizing noise. As he climbed, he felt the weight of the space below him, of the life that had unfolded in secrecy beneath the forest floor. When he emerged once more into daylight, he restored the hatch carefully, arranging the boards and leaves exactly as he had found them. The forest closed over the spot, concealing it once again. He stood and took in the surroundings, seeing them now through a different lens. The trees no longer felt like neutral witnesses. They felt complicit, having sheltered a secret for years without judgment or comment. As he prepared to move on, he understood that he was no longer simply a hunter, passing through familiar territory. He had become an unwilling observer of a story that refused to stay buried. And somewhere, either within the forest or beyond it, the man who had lived beneath the ground might still be moving, watching and waiting. Leaving the hatch concealed beneath its careful covering did not bring the sense of closure the man had hoped for. Instead, it followed him like a weight pressing between his shoulder blades. Each step away from the spot felt provisional, as though the forest itself might call him back if he moved too far too quickly. He did not go far. He circled the area at a distance, scanning the trees, the undergrowth, and the subtle pathways that only someone accustomed to the woods would notice. The dog moved with restrained alertness, no longer leading, no longer pulling ahead, but staying close enough that their awareness overlapped. It paused frequently, lifting its head, testing the air. There was no clear sign of another presence, yet the animal's behavior suggested uncertainty rather than calm. The man trusted that reaction more than his own reasoning. Dogs did not speculate. They responded. He found a fallen log not far from the concealed hatch and sat there for several minutes, allowing his thoughts to settle. He replayed what he had seen below, not as isolated details but as a continuous narrative. The space had not felt abandoned. It had felt paused, as if someone had stepped away with the intention of returning, leaving behind a life arranged carefully enough to resume at any moment. The realization shifted his focus. If the underground compartment was not a relic, then the life it supported had extended beyond the space itself. Whoever had lived there would have moved through the forest, gathered supplies, observed changes, and left subtle traces behind. The forest was not empty. It was merely discreet. He began to widen his search, moving slowly and deliberately, careful to disturb as little as possible. His eyes scanned the ground for broken twigs, compressed leaves, slight variations in soil texture. These were signs most people overlooked, but to him they formed a language. A disturbed patch near a tree suggested a resting spot. A faint indentation near a stream hinted at repeated visits. None of these signs alone meant much. Together they painted a picture of routine. As he followed these indications, the sense of another life became more tangible. He discovered a place where branches had been trimmed deliberately to improve visibility without creating an obvious clearing. Nearby, a flat stone bore marks consistent with repeated use, perhaps as a surface for sorting items or preparing food. These were not the marks of survivalist improvisation. They were the habits of someone who intended to remain invisible while still maintaining order. The man felt a strange mixture of intrusion and responsibility. He had not been invited into this hidden existence, yet he had stepped into it nonetheless. Turning away now would not erase what he had learned. The forest had yielded its secret, and secrets once exposed demanded acknowledgement. Eventually he returned to the hatch. This time his descent felt less like an act of discovery and more like an examination. He reopened the concealed entrance, again taking care to preserve its disguise. The dog remained above, positioned to watch the surroundings, its posture tense but controlled. Inside, the underground compartment greeted him with the same preserved stillness. The air was unchanged, cool and dry enough to protect the contents. He moved through the space with renewed purpose, no longer overwhelmed by the implications but focused on understanding the life that had unfolded here. He began with the personal items. The box he had resealed earlier waited where he had left it. He opened it again, more slowly this time, allowing himself to linger over each object. The wallet contained more than identification. Tucked behind the cards were folded notes, creased and softened by repeated handling. He unfolded them carefully. They were not letters, they were reminders. Dates, names, short phrases written in a deliberate hand. Some were crossed out, others circled. The handwriting was steady, disciplined, free of emotional excess. Whoever had written these notes had not been unraveling. They had been organizing their thoughts. The photographs told a similar story. He examined them one by one. Some showed the man identified in the wallet at different ages, in ordinary settings that contrasted sharply with the life implied by the bunker. A house, a street, a group of people standing together, unaware that one of them would one day vanish from the world above. The expressions were unremarkable, almost mundane. That too was unsettling. There was nothing about the man that suggested he belonged beneath the forest. Other photographs were more recent. The lighting was poorer, the framing less casual. They showed landscapes rather than people. Sections of forest, isolated roads, buildings photographed from a distance. These images were observational, not sentimental. They suggested someone watching, documenting, keeping track. The man set the photographs aside and turned to the shelves again. He examined the supplies not just as objects, but as evidence of time. Food consumption patterns suggested long stays punctuated by absences. Medical supplies indicated careful planning for illness or injury, but not panic. Everything pointed to a life lived deliberately outside of society, rather than one forced there by sudden crisis. He noticed the newspapers again and studied them more closely. The dates spanned many years, but they were not random. Each paper corresponded to a specific event or development. He recognized some of the headlines now that he looked more carefully. Court decisions, investigative reports, official conclusions. The missing persons case stood out among them. He remembered it clearly enough once he focused. It had dominated local news for months, then gradually faded as attention shifted elsewhere. Several people had vanished within a relatively short period. The investigation had been extensive at first, but it had ended quietly, with official statements and unsatisfying explanations. The public had accepted them, not because they were convincing, but because there was nothing else to hold on to. Now standing beneath the forest, the man saw those events through a different lens. The documents he found were not simply clippings preserved out of personal interest. They were part of a larger effort to preserve information that had been forgotten or dismissed. He located a second container, one he had not opened before. Inside were folders sealed against moisture. He removed one and opened it carefully. The contents were methodical. Copies of reports, notes comparing timelines, maps with specific points marked. The handwriting matched that of the notes in the wallet. Whoever had assembled this material had done so patiently, perhaps obsessively, but always with purpose. The man felt his unease deepen. This was not the work of a bystander or an amateur investigator. It felt like the work of someone directly affected by the case, someone with access to information not widely available, someone with a reason to distrust the official version of events. As he continued examining the folders, inconsistencies emerged, dates that did not align, witness statements that contradicted one another, evidence that had been noted and then dismissed without clear explanation. He was not a detective, but he did not need formal training to recognize patterns. Something had gone wrong in that investigation, and it had gone wrong deliberately. He leaned back against the wall of the compartment, the weight of the discovery pressing on him. The life hidden beneath the forest was not merely one of avoidance. It was one of observation, preservation, and waiting. The man who had lived here had not disappeared to escape the world. He had disappeared to watch it from a distance. The implications were troubling. If the occupant of this place had gathered evidence, then they believed the truth would one day matter. That meant they either planned to return or hoped someone else would find what they had hidden. The man glanced toward the ladder leading back to the forest above. For the first time since discovering the hatch, he felt a sense of urgency that went beyond curiosity. This was no longer just about a hidden life. It was about unresolved harm, about people who had vanished and never been accounted for properly. A faint sound reached him again, this time clearer than before. It came from above, a subtle shift, the unmistakable sound of weight moving through dry leaves. He froze, listening intently. The sound did not repeat, but it was enough to remind him that the forest was not static. He gathered the documents carefully, returning them to their places exactly as he had found them. He did not want to leave signs of interference. If someone returned, any disruption might alert them that their secret was no longer secure. Before leaving the compartment, he took one last look around. The space no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a record, a preserved fragment of a life that had been deliberately erased from public memory. When he climbed back into the forest and restored the hatch once more, the act felt heavier than before. He was no longer just concealing a space, he was preserving a story. As he moved away, the forest seemed to close in around him, not in hostility, but in quiet complicity. It had kept this secret for years. Now it had passed that responsibility to him, and he understood, with a clarity that left little room for doubt, that whatever had driven a man to live beneath the ground had not ended with his disappearance. It had merely been postponed, waiting for someone else to uncover the traces left behind. By the time the man left the concealed place for the second time, the forest no longer felt like neutral ground. Every sound carried weight. Every pause in the wind seemed charged with meaning. He moved slowly, deliberately, guiding the dog away from the hatch and deeper into the trees, not to flee but to think. What he had uncovered beneath the forest floor had shifted from a curiosity into something far more dangerous, a narrative that contradicted an official past. He needed distance, both physical and mental, to assemble what he had seen into something coherent. They stopped near a shallow rise where the terrain allowed a clear view between the trunks. The man crouched, resting his forearms on his knees, and let his breathing settle. The dog stayed close, eyes scanning, ears alert, its posture mirroring his own restraint. There was no immediate threat, but the unease lingered, thick and persistent. He replayed the contents of the underground compartment in his mind, this time focusing not on the personal items, but on the structure of the evidence itself. The photographs, the notes, the documents, the careful preservation of materials that most people would have destroyed or discarded long ago. This was not the behavior of someone hiding randomly. It was the behavior of someone building a case. The realization brought him back to the folders he had only briefly examined. He knew then that he would have to return to the bunker one more time. Leaving without fully understanding what lay there would be reckless. If this place truly contained evidence connected to a closed criminal investigation, then ignorance was no protection. It was a liability. He waited several minutes, listening, watching, ensuring the forest remained undisturbed. Only when he was satisfied did he retrace his steps, approaching the concealed hatch from a different angle to avoid leaving an obvious path. The dog followed silently, disciplined enough to move where he moved, stop when he stopped. Opening the hatch again and felt heavier than before. The cold air rose as it had earlier, but now it carried an added weight, as though the space below anticipated his return. He secured the dog above ground once more and descended, flashlight in hand, his movements careful and efficient. Inside, the underground compartment felt unchanged, but his perception of it had sharpened. He moved directly toward the storage section where the folders were kept, bypassing the bed, the supplies, the familiar signs of a hidden life. His focus was narrow now. The first container he opened held several sealed folders arranged chronologically. He removed one at random and opened it, spreading its contents across the table. The documents were copies, not originals, but they were thorough. Police reports, interview summaries, evidence logs. Everything had been duplicated with care. As he read, the pattern became unmistakable. The missing persons case had not been a single incident, but a sequence of disappearances clustered within a limited time frame and geographic area. The official explanation had framed them as unrelated events, coincidences bound together by proximity and public anxiety. Yet the documents told a different story. When laid out side by side, the timelines overlapped too neatly to be accidental. He noticed the first inconsistency in the witness statements. Several accounts contradicted one another in small but significant ways. Times did not align. Locations shifted subtly between versions. Details that should have been clarified were left vague, then quietly dropped from subsequent reports. He moved on to the evidence logs. Certain items had been recorded initially, then marked as inconclusive or irrelevant without explanation. Others were listed as missing, never officially recovered, their absence accepted without challenge. The man felt a tightening in his chest as he realized how deliberate those omissions appeared when viewed together. Maps filled the next folder, hand-drawn copies layered over printed ones, with routes marked in pencil and ink. He traced them slowly with his finger, recognizing familiar areas of the forest, nearby roads, abandoned structures. The same locations appeared repeatedly across different dates, connecting disappearances that had been officially treated as isolated. This was not speculation. It was analysis. He turned to another folder, this one thinner but heavier in implication. Inside were documents related to internal reviews and administrative decisions, transfers, case reassignments, sudden changes in jurisdiction, all of them occurring at critical moments in the investigation. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. The case had not been solved because solving it would have implicated people who were not supposed to be implicated. The investigation had been guided away from conclusions that were inconvenient, then quietly sealed under the weight of authority. The man leaned back, his mind racing. He was not trained to investigate crimes, but he understood human behavior. He understood how systems protected themselves. What lay before him was not evidence of incompetence, but of intention. The next container held something that made his breath catch. Inside were weapons. They were not displayed or arranged theatrically. They were stored with the same careful order as everything else in the bunker. Each was cleaned, wrapped, and tagged with handwritten notes, dates, locations, observations. Some of the weapons were familiar types, the kind commonly owned and legally registered. Others were not. Their presence alone suggested a connection to activities far removed from lawful hunting or self-defense. The notes accompanying them were precise, unemotional. This weapon was found here. That one was recovered under these circumstances. Another was linked to an event mentioned in the documents he had already read. The implication was staggering. These were not merely possessions. They were artifacts preserved because they mattered, because they told a story that had never been officially acknowledged. The man felt a surge of anger he had not expected. Not explosive, but cold and focused. People had vanished. Families had been left without answers. And somewhere along the line, the truth had been buried, not by time, but by choice. He examined one of the weapons more closely, careful not to leave traces. The serial number had been partially obscured, but not entirely destroyed. It was as though whoever had handled it wanted the truth hidden, but not erased completely. That detail struck him as significant. The man who had lived beneath the forest had not destroyed the evidence. He had preserved it. He had chosen secrecy over exposure, but not oblivion. Perhaps he had been waiting for the right moment, or the right person. The man closed the container slowly. He felt the weight of responsibility settle fully now. This was no longer a personal discovery or a moral curiosity. This was evidence of a crime that extended far beyond one hidden life. He understood the risk with unsettling clarity. If the wrong people learned that this place had been discovered, the evidence would vanish. Worse, so might the person who had found it. He also understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. Silence would make him complicit in the continued erasure of the truth. As he prepared to leave the bunker once more, he took care to restore everything exactly as he had found it. The documents were returned to their folders. The weapons were resealed. The containers were placed back into their positions. He moved with the same precision as the person who had created this hidden archive. Before extinguishing the flashlight, he paused and looked around the space one last time. The bunker no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a courtroom sealed underground, its verdict delayed but not dismissed. Climbing back into the forest, he restored the hatch with meticulous care. Leaves were replaced. Soil was smoothed. The ground returned to its carefully constructed anonymity. When he stood again among the trees, the forest seemed unchanged. Sunlight filtered through the canopy. The dog waited, alert but silent. Yet the man knew that the past beneath his feet had shifted irrevocably. The case that had been closed was no longer closed to him, and that knowledge once acquired could not be buried again. The forest seemed closer now, as though the trees had shifted inward while he was underground, tightening the space around him. He moved away from the concealed hatch slowly, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Each step was deliberate, chosen to leave as little trace as possible. He did not head straight back toward the route he had taken earlier. Instead, he angled through denser growth, trusting his familiarity with the terrain to guide him without carving a visible path. The dog stayed close, its earlier uncertainty replaced by focused vigilance. It did not pull ahead or lag behind. Its attention moved constantly, nose testing the air, ears adjusting to faint sounds. The man read those signals with growing unease. The animal was no longer reacting to old scents or residual presence. It was listening. He paused at intervals, letting the forest settle. Each time he heard nothing beyond the ordinary sounds of wind through branches and distant birds. Yet the absence of disturbance felt unnatural. He had spent enough time alone in remote places to know when silence was earned and when it was manufactured. This silence carried a tension that did not belong to nature. The knowledge he carried now weighed heavily. It was not the shock of discovery that troubled him, but its implications. The underground compartment was not simply a hiding place. It was a deliberate archive, assembled over years, perhaps decades. Someone had gone to great lengths to preserve evidence that contradicted an official narrative. That meant the truth had been known, or at least suspected, long before he stumbled upon it. He understood then that the most dangerous aspect of the discovery was not what lay beneath the forest, but who might still care about it. He stopped near a shallow ravine where the ground dipped and rose again, providing a natural break in sightlines. He crouched, resting his hand against the rough bark of a tree, and allowed himself a moment to think without movement. The dog mirrored him, lowering its body, gaze fixed outward. The questions came in steady succession. Why had the occupant of the bunker never come forward? Why preserve evidence instead of exposing it? Why continue to maintain the shelter long after the case had been officially closed? The answers, whatever they were, pointed toward fear rather than apathy. Fear of retaliation, fear of erasure, fear that the system meant to deliver justice would instead destroy those who challenged it. The man realized with chilling clarity that this fear might now extend to him. He considered his options carefully. Leaving the forest and pretending none of this had happened was no longer possible. He would notice every news report differently now, every familiar name tinged with suspicion. Ignorance had been stripped away. What remained was responsibility. Calling local authorities immediately was the most obvious course and the most dangerous. The documents in the bunker suggested that parts of the original investigation had been influenced, redirected, or deliberately weakened. If that was true, then handing the discovery to the same structure that had failed once before could ensure its disappearance a second time. Removing the evidence himself was equally risky. The materials were too extensive, too complex, and too fragile to move without compromising their value, and being found in possession of them would raise questions he could not easily answer. He needed distance, time, and proof that could not be dismissed as rumor or imagination. As he moved through the forest, he became acutely aware of his own presence. He studied the ground ahead, the brush behind him, the spaces between trees. Several times he thought he heard something beyond the ordinary sounds of the woods, a shift of weight, a branch pressed downward rather than snapped. Each time the sound dissolved before he could confirm it. The dog reacted subtly, never barking, but adjusting its stance, aligning itself towards sounds that never fully resolved. That unsettled him more than any clear sign would have. Whatever was out there, if anything, was careful. He altered his route again, doubling back briefly before changing direction. It was a tactic he had used before to confirm whether he was being followed. The forest offered no immediate answer, but the absence of confirmation did not reassure him. It simply meant that whoever might be nearby knew how to move. Eventually, he reached a section of higher ground where the trees thinned slightly and the terrain opened enough to allow a wider view. He stopped there, heart steady, breathing controlled, and let his gaze travel slowly through the trunks. Nothing moved. No figure emerged. No sound betrayed a presence. Still, the sense of being observed did not fade. He thought again of the man whose life had been hidden beneath the forest. That man had chosen isolation over exposure, concealment over confrontation. Perhaps he had learned the same lesson the hard way. Perhaps survival had required silence. But the evidence preserved underground suggested that silence had never been acceptance. It had been a pause. The man reached into his pack and removed his phone. There was no signal here as expected, but he did not need one yet. He needed documentation. Carefully, he reviewed the images he had already taken of the bunker, the documents, the weapons. He ensured they were clear, properly framed, impossible to dismiss as fabrications. He backed them up to a secure storage device he carried for emergencies, something he had once considered excessive preparation. Now it felt inadequate. He powered the phone off and returned it to his pack. Digital evidence could vanish. Devices could fail. He would need redundancy. Memory alone was not enough. As he continued toward the edge of the forest, the sounds gradually changed. The air felt lighter. The density of the trees lessened. With each step, the sense of pressure eased slightly, though it never fully left him. He thought about the people named in the documents. Some were dead. Some had vanished. Others had moved on, their lives continuing uninterrupted. The injustice of that disparity settled heavily in his chest. Truth, he realized, did not assert itself. It had to be carried, often at great cost. The dog stopped suddenly, muscles tensing. The man froze, scanning the area. This time the reaction was sharper, more focused. The animal's attention fixed on a point far off to the side, where the forest sloped downward toward an old service road. The man followed its gaze. For a brief moment he thought he saw movement. Not a person, not clearly, just a disturbance in the pattern of shadows. Then it was gone. He waited, counting his breaths, listening. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no engine, no voices. Still, the message was clear enough. Someone could be nearby, or someone had been. He resumed moving, this time with greater urgency, but without haste. Panic would leave evidence. Control would not. He maintained his pace, adjusted his route once more, and kept the dog close. By the time the forest finally began to thin enough to suggest the approach of more familiar ground, his thoughts had settled into grim clarity. The knowledge he carried was dangerous not because it was dramatic, but because it threatened stability. It challenged a version of the past that many people depended on remaining intact. He understood now why the man beneath the forest had waited, why he had watched instead of acted, why he had hidden the truth rather than risk being destroyed by it. Standing at the edge of the trees, the man looked back one last time. The forest appeared unchanged, peaceful even. Nothing about it hinted at the buried archive beneath its soil or the lives entangled in its silence. He turned away and stepped forward, knowing that the most perilous part of the journey was no longer behind him. It lay ahead in a world that preferred its stories closed, its questions unanswered, and its truths buried deep enough to be forgotten. The forest released him gradually, as though unwilling to let go all at once. The trees thinned, the undergrowth softened, and the ground grew more even beneath his boots. Yet the tension he carried did not ease with the widening space. It followed him, persistent and heavy, shaped not by fear but by certainty. The certainty that what he had uncovered could not remain where it was, and that whatever choice he made next would define more than just his own path. He slowed his pace deliberately, forcing himself not to rush the final stretch. Panic, he knew, left patterns. It bent decisions and revealed intentions. He had survived long enough in difficult places to understand that survival depended as much on restraint as on action. The dog stayed close, its posture calmer now, though it still scanned the surroundings with disciplined awareness. Whatever unease had gripped it deeper in the forest had not vanished, but it had receded, replaced by a watchfulness that felt more controlled. As the forest opened further, the man allowed himself to think not in fragments, but in sequence. The underground compartment, the preserved life, the documents and weapons, the methodical effort to record a truth that had been quietly erased. All of it formed a single narrative, one that pointed not toward accident or coincidence, but toward design. He understood now that the most important decision had already been made by someone else long before him. The man who had lived beneath the forest had chosen not to destroy the evidence, not to release it prematurely, and not to entrust it to institutions that had already failed. Instead, he had preserved it, waiting for circumstances he could not control. Perhaps waiting for someone who could act where he could not. That realization shifted the weight of responsibility. This was not merely a discovery. It was a handover. The man stopped at a clearing where sunlight spilled freely onto the ground. From here, the forest behind him looked no different than it ever had. Tall trees, deep shadows, and a silence that concealed more than it revealed. Somewhere within that silence lay a hatch carefully returned to anonymity. Beneath it, a record of lives interrupted and truths deferred. He knelt and rested his hands on his thighs, letting his breathing steady. The dog stood beside him, relaxed but attentive, as though sensing the importance of the pause. He reached into his pack and reviewed his preparations once more. Not physically, but mentally. The images he had taken, the notes he had memorized, the details he had committed to memory with the precision of someone who knew that memory alone might one day be tested. He understood that he could not act impulsively. The documents beneath the forest were not accusations. They were foundations. Exposing them carelessly would invite dismissal or worse. The truth they suggested would need to be presented in a way that could not be easily erased or discredited. That meant patience, strategy, and distance from those who might have reason to interfere. The local authorities were no longer an option in his mind. The materials he had seen made that clear. The original investigation had not failed by chance. It had been guided, redirected, and closed for reasons that had nothing to do with resolution. Trusting the same structure again would only repeat the pattern. Nor could he act alone in the open. Carrying the evidence himself would make him vulnerable. The people implicated in the documents were not faceless abstractions. They were individuals with influence, resources, and a vested interest in preserving the past as it stood. He rose slowly, feeling the ache in his muscles that reminded him how long he had been moving under strain. The physical fatigue grounded him. It kept his thoughts from spiraling into speculation. This was not a story about heroes or revelations. It was about endurance. As he continued onward, the sounds of the forest gave way to the faint indications of the wider world. A distant engine, the echo of movement beyond the trees, signs of roads and structures that marked the boundary between concealment and exposure. With each step, he felt the shift from one domain to another, from a place where secrets could sleep indefinitely to one where they demanded consequence. He glanced back once more, not out of nostalgia, but recognition. The forest had done its part. It had sheltered a hidden life, preserved evidence, and finally revealed it when chance aligned with readiness. What happened next was no longer its concern. The man understood then that his life would not return to its former shape. Even if he chose silence, the knowledge he carried would alter how he saw the world. Every official statement, every closed case, every confident conclusion would be measured against what he had seen buried beneath the ground. Innocence, once lost, did not return. Yet silence was not what the evidence beneath the forest had been preserved for. The careful organization, the deliberate restraint, the refusal to destroy or abandon it all pointed toward a future moment of reckoning. That moment had arrived, not with noise or spectacle, but with a quiet hunter stepping into a place he had never intended to find. He reached the edge of the forest at last and stopped. The boundary was unmarked but unmistakable. Beyond it lay a world governed by rules and narratives that rarely welcomed disruption. He felt no illusion about what waited there. Exposure would bring scrutiny. Action would invite resistance. Even choosing caution would carry its own risks. He placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady warmth and the reassuring presence of something real and immediate. The animal had followed him without question into a place where lives had been buried, and now followed him back without hesitation. That loyalty felt like an anchor. The man took one final breath and stepped forward. He did not yet know exactly how or when he would act. He only knew that the truth beneath the forest was no longer alone. It had been seen, understood, and carried into the open world, where it could no longer be dismissed as rumor or forgotten as inconvenience. Behind him, the forest stood unchanged, tall and silent, guarding what remained hidden and surrendering what had been found. Ahead of him lay uncertainty, danger, and the long work of bringing buried truths into the light. And though he walked away without looking back again, he understood that part of him would always remain there, standing over a concealed hatch in the deep forest, at the moment when a closed past refused to stay closed any longer. If this story caught your attention, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the next video and explore the other stories on the channel. There's much more waiting for you. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it.